Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode. Sir, yes sir. You need to check all of our food. Fine. I need to tell you every time I leave my post? No problem. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. Sir, yes sir. I have a large-ish supply of malicious compliance which really aren't worth sharing, given that they were during my time in the military, and would require a staggering amount of explanation to make sense to anyone who wasn't in that particular military at that particular time. But I was recently reminded of one which probably translates well enough, so I'll throw it out for your amusement, even though it requires a fair bit of exposition. I must warn you. If you are uncomfortable with feces or runaway body functions, you may want to skip this one. This was in the very late stages of my career. To clarify this, the army I was in at that time basically divided itself into two parts: Field Force, which was the fighting soldiers, and Logistics Command, who were the non-fighting soldiers. I know the names have changed since then, but this was many years ago, and I really don't care. Field Force included such corps as infantry, artillery, engineers. Logistics Command included corps like transport, ordnance, catering. At that time and place, members of the Combat Corps referred to members of the non-combat corps as POGES, or POGOs. It was a derogatory term, and could result in blood on the floor if tempers were high. Anyway, it came to pass that I was due for a posting. There were reasons, however, why I needed to stay in the city I was currently posted to. My head of corps agreed that my reasons were valid, so I was given a compassionate posting to a unit I wouldn't normally go to. This unit provided a function for the entire army. Sorta. Before I marched into this unit, I began to pick up some pretty clear hints that this was not going to be a good posting. But part of being a soldier is that you let it flow off your back and do the job. After all, if it was easy, a civilian could do it. Just kidding. I came to loathe that posting. This unit had some of the most incompetent people I have ever met. A few of the senior other ranks, enlisted as distinct from officers, were outright thieves. Several members of the unit were barely functional alcoholics. A number of the officers gave every appearance of cultivating stupidity as a way of life. This was my first posting outside of my corps, and the first time I'd had any long-term exposure to a lot of POGES. Before posting to that unit, I had figured that POGES were necessary, and were just soldiers like anyone else. I still imagine that is true, but this unit had some of the sorriest examples of POG I can imagine. There were people posted to this unit who were living examples of the reason why combat soldiers have disdain for those who cluster at the rear and think they are roughing it. It became clear to me that there were two kinds of soldier at that unit: people, like myself, who were on compassionate posting, and the rest who were of so little use that they were dumped by their corps to get them out of the way. My experiences in that unit put me off so much that I decided that it was time to exit the military and return to civilian life. To be entirely clear, I viewed certain members of this unit as a complete disgrace to the military. Not because they were POGES, but because they had all the flaws of soldiers, with none of the redeeming features. Not everyone who was dumped to that unit was a dirtbag, many of them were just minimally useful, shall we say. About 40% of us were doing all the necessary work for that unit. And to be honest, we weren't working all that hard. As a member of a fighting corps, I was in good shape, although I admit I did put on a couple of kilos during my time in that unit. I had no problem with our annual physical fitness test, which among other things, involved a 5 km run in under 18 minutes. This was not the case for every member of the unit, as several of them would have been hard-pressed to walk 5 kilometers with no time limit. As a result, we had one particular officer, we'll call him Major Hardon, and yes, he was a POG, who decided to crack down on those who were clearly unfit. To that end, he'd volunteered and was in charge of the unit's physical training schedule. Normally that job would be in the hands of a dedicated PT instructor, but the unit didn't have one because the PTIs, were too valuable to waste. Unfortunately, Major Hardon and I did not like each other. He was one of the members of that unit I viewed with complete disdain. He had tried to make my life difficult for some months, but he wasn't terribly bright, so I'd managed to avoid most of his bullshit, and in a couple of instances I'd managed to arrange for some of it to splash back on him. What little he had managed to make stick on me was so trivial that I was unfazed. A little more background: we'd been taught that, regardless of our personal opinion of any particular officer, we must respect the uniform. Basically what that meant was, yes, there are some complete dickheads, but they are still officers, so shut up and soldier. Which is fair enough unless it becomes life-threatening. So I was always scrupulous in obeying the orders of all my superior officers, and maintained a very professional attitude regardless of their failings. However, when an officer is trying his best to make your life miserable, and doing a piss-poor job of it, well, I'm only human, and while I did my best, I imagine that it was obvious that I viewed the whole thing, and him, with mild amusement. Major Hardon was not a happy camper. When this officer found out that I had elected to leave the military, his campaign of harassment ramped up. In part because I had been overheard on the phone with my head of corps recommending that they not send any more real soldiers to this unit to be forced to associate with a bunch of useless pogas with no clue whatsoever. Apparently Major Hardon had a bit of a problem with the fact that he was a pogue, so he started to get serious about messing me around. I just dodged what I could and shrugged off the rest. As his attempts to get me in trouble continued to fail, he got more and more annoyed. 2 weeks before I was due to be discharged, our annual PT test came up. Normally in such a case the soon-to-be ex-member would be excused as there wasn't much point, and they always needed someone to man the phones while people were taking the test. I was, however, ordered to take the test. As I noted, this wouldn't normally be a problem for me. However, on the day of the test, I was suffering the effects of my now ex-wife's attempt to make sushi the night before. I won't be graphic, but let's just say that I was deeply invested in staying close to the toilet. I explained this before the test started and asked to be excused to go to the nearby medical unit, but was refused permission by, you guessed it, Major Hardon. Somehow I managed to complete the first 2 required parts of the test, basically chin-ups and sit-ups, while rushing to the toilet in between. But I knew that I wasn't going to make the 5 km run, so once again I asked Major Hardon for permission to go to the medical unit. Once again he refused. So we set off on the 5 km run. Predictably, a few hundred meters into the run and well, let's just say I was wearing tracksuit pants, I imagine what the US calls sweatpants, and they were now going to have to be thrown away. I started walking at this point. I could have continued to run, but I was annoyed and saw little point to this farce. I was surprised when one of the unit cars pulled up and Major Hardon jumped out and started screaming at me, demanding to know why I was walking. I tried to explain but only got out about 4 words before he started screaming that he didn't believe me. He then ordered me to go back to the unit and wait for me in my office. So I turned around, walked back to the unit, and went straight to his office. I closed the door, and I then stood at ease in front of his desk and waited. By the time Major Hardon returned, about 30 minutes later, I had lost control of my bowels so many times that it wasn't just leaking out the bottom of my pants, it was pouring out. The carpet on the floor was soaked in the stuff. The stench was making my eyes water. I was actually starting to feel weak from fluid loss. When he burst into the room I snapped to attention. The carpet actually squelched when I did that, and had the pleasure of watching the color drain from his face as he nearly vomited from the smell. Before he could say a word I said, "Sir, I am afraid it is now imperative that I go to the medical unit," and marched out as best I could. He was blocking the doorway, but got out of my way damn quick. I got the first person I encountered to help me to the medics, who took one look and sniff at me and asked if I could drink or did they need to get me to hospital for IN4. The nearest military hospital was a couple of hours away, and our medics did not like to have to take soldiers to the local civilian hospital, which had a, deservedly, bad reputation, so we avoided the 4 option. In between drinking several liters of some foul-tasting stuff that they swore would rehydrate me, I used the shower and sat around in a threadbare hospital robe. It always bugged me that they weren't green, lol, went to the toilet several times, and saw the doctor, who wrote a chit giving me the next 10 days off when I explained that it was definitely food poisoning, my wife was suffering the same symptoms, and why I'd ended up covered in it. The doctor, BTW, was very unhappy to hear that I'd been made carry out a PT test in my condition, which is why he gave me 10 days off. One of the unit drivers got my uniform for me and took me home, still in that stupid hospital robe with my arse hanging out, where I collapsed in bed with my wife and insisted that she never make sushi ever again. Major Hardon's boss called me at home the next day. Colonel Caffeine, so called because he drank his coffee corrosively strong, lol, asked me what had happened and got me to repeat the conversations word for word. He was even very patient when I had to blurt "excuse me sir" and dash to the toilet. He asked me if I wanted to pursue disciplinary action, which I hadn't even thought of at that point, but I responded that I was sure he, the colonel, could deal with it in-house. This is important because A. Nobody wants formal discipline because that's where the really nasty stuff happens, and B. If I had requested formal discipline then I would not have been discharged until the entire thing was complete. The colonel assured me it would be dealt with. In that the colonel, I note, full colonel, which is a lot of rank, was a non-pogue Vietnam veteran who was in that unit on compassionate posting. I am sure he took the appropriate steps. I just don't know what they were. I returned to the unit 10 days after the point test and began the march-out procedure. Normally that takes a day, but nobody objected to me taking 3 days to do it. I was informed that Major Hardon's office still reeked, even after the carpet and underlay had been torn up. General consensus was that, by the time they'd ripped up the carpet, it had soaked into the floorboards and they'd have to be replaced. Major Hardon, BTW, avoided me like the plague for the 3 days before I marched out to be discharged. I have no idea what happened to Major Hardon as a result of that malicious compliance, but I like to think that it didn't do his career much good. I'm absolutely positive that it made spending any time in his office a stomach-churning nightmare until they got rid of the smell. Postscript. Before people ask, I'll fill in some details to answer any inevitable questions. Yes, our medics were fully capable of running in 4 into me, but at that time and place they were only permitted to do so in a medical emergency, which I did not class as. I was under strict instructions to call the medical unit each day, so that they could assess if I needed to go to hospital. But frankly, after the second day I was fine. They, the medics, assured me that they had disposed of my PT gear in a biohazard bag BTW. My track pants weren't the soft terry tolling absorbent kind of material. They were a ripstop nylon material which had all the absorbent qualities of a plastic bag. As a result they acted pretty much as a pipe rather than a nappy diaper for the US audience. I had worn them specifically because I anticipated I might have an accident, and I didn't want it noticeable. The day I marched out of that unit I spoke to my head of corps, and they told me, discreetly, that they would use that unit to dump the few people they didn't want around, but they would stop using it for compassionate postings. I've done some research, just out of curiosity, and it turns out that unit was eliminated a few years after I left. Its few essential functions were absorbed by other units. She became my ex-wife for reasons other than her skills as a culinary assassin. You need to check all of our food. Fine. So this happened like 7 or 8 years ago when I was jobbing at a driving service while I was a student. The driving service was one for people with disabilities that could not drive or walk on their own. Our main office was in the building of a housing/working facility for disabled people. The two companies, our driver's service and the housing facility, were loosely connected as they were both financed by the same organization. However, management-wise THDY were clearly separated. We were about 15 drivers at this location, and we shared our lunch/social room with about 10 caretakers. Since our schedules were horribly organized, the drivers often had idle time, so the social room was where everybody hung around waiting for work. One day my boss, call him Tom, brought cake to work because he became 60. The cake was enormous. Like, a wedding cake could hide behind it twice. I can only imagine how expensive it must have been. At 9 every driver had eaten some pieces, and there was still like 80% left of it, so Tom told the caretakers THDY should feel free to take some. Then Karen happened. She was something like the security inspector of the facility. So she had authority over the caretakers but no dealings with the driving service. Her job was to watch for potential hazards, organize the caretaker's schedule, and generally having an eye on everything happening. When she heard there was cake, she was furious. She and Tom couldn't stand each other, so she was always trying to ruin his day. In this particular instance, she claimed the cake was a health hazard as it contained cream, and she could not verify whether the cooling chain was never broken during transport. So she threw it all away. Roughly €400 worth of food just thrown away. Needless to say, Tom was less than amused. He went extremely mad. He was usually a very calm and gentle man, and this was the only time ever that I heard him shouting at someone. Still, there was nothing he could do. Karen could basically declare anything a hazard and take action how she saw fit, and her higher-up didn't really care. To make matters worse, she doubled down and demanded that every food that was brought into the social room had to be inspected by her first. Cue malicious compliance. Obviously, all the drivers were mad at Karen for upsetting Tom and for throwing away a perfectly fine cake. So the next day, First thing in the morning, 15 drivers went to her office. Everyone with his lunch demanding she inspect it. It took her roughly 10 minutes looking at sandwiches and answering questions whether mayonnaise was too hazardous to be brought in. This went on for the whole week, each day our questions about hazardous foods becoming more dumb and degenerate. On Friday it took her more than 2 hours to inspect our lunch as we would collectively steal her time. Afternoon she said she got the message and that sandwiches got a general okay and not to bother her with it anymore. Fine. The following week we went out of our way to eat anything but sandwiches. Salads, cake, pretzels, normal lunch stuff. Every day there was a line in front of her office having their lunch checked, asking stupid questions whether this food was or was not too dangerous to enter the social room. Karen was losing her patience, becoming increasingly aggressive towards us, but still refused to apologize to Tom. Then, at the end of week 2 of food checking, Tom brought a bucket for lunch. When he entered Karen's office to have his lunch checked, like he did every day, and opened the lid of his lunch pot, the smell hit everyone in vicinity like a brick to the face. Apparently he had made some unholy mix of garlic, cream, pickles, and herring which he called fish soup. It looked like what happens if you leave something dead in the sun for too long, all brownish and sluggy with some green specks in it, and it reeked twice as bad as it looked. Karen looked as if she would puke any moment, commanding him to remove this monstrosity from her office. Tom asked if she didn't want to check it, since he could imagine the cooling chain could have been broken during transport or sometime in the last 2 weeks. The lot of us drivers laughed so hard, I swear some nearly choked from laughter. This was roughly the time that Karen had to admit defeat. Food checking stopped immediately, and the following week Tom brought another cake. Sorry for any typos. I need to tell you every time I leave my post? No problem. I should start out by saying I had this job as a hostess for 2-ish years before this new manager came alone. I should also state that I have a little bit of an issue when people think they can boss me around just because they are male and I am female. Well, that's exactly what happened with this manager. He treated every single female that worked at this restaurant like shit. I just so happened to be the only one who ever went back at him because I don't deserve to be treated like that. Anyways, when he started, he gave us this new rule. The host stand was not allowed to be unoccupied under any circumstance. For example, if you had to go into the kitchen to let a server know they had just been sat, too bad. You first had to find someone to cover your post, and then you were allowed in the kitchen to let the server know. Well, obviously this doesn't work when it's busy and you need to let the server know right away. I'm going to set the scene here because now this is where the story actually happens. My manager had to work behind the bar this night as the bartender because they didn't show up for whatever reason. As the hostess, it is one of my responsibilities to take to-go orders, and then the server puts them in and gets the tip. Well, the customer only knows that I take the orders, so whenever there is an issue they would come to me. I had someone order a kid's burger and fries, and that was it. After 25 minutes, possibly even longer, the customer came up to me and asked where it was. No problem, I will go check. Well, no servers knew what I was talking about, so I went into the back to talk to the chef, and he said, oh, it's right here, but no one got the ketchup yet. So I quickly grabbed the ketchup, and as I am doing that, the manager sees that I am not at my stand and starts screaming at me in the kitchen. Basically calling me stupid and unable to do my job, and what can't I get through my head that under any circumstance can I leave the stand without asking his permission? Fine. You got it, boss. The next table I sat, I was fuming because guess what? The server was in the kitchen. So I walked right up to the very crowded bar and said very loudly, "Excuse me, manager," and he looked at me, along with everyone else at the bar, "Am I allowed to do my job and go in the kitchen and let server know I just sat her table?" The customers at the bar were in such shock that I even had to ask this question. My manager was left red as can be and told me yes, but I had to make it quick. Later in the night he comes up to me and asks if we can speak about the interaction we had early. Sure, no problem. We had a little side room with sliding doors where you could close them, but keep it cracked so you could see the front door of the restaurant. I was facing both doors and my manager was facing me, with his back to both doors. So again he starts yelling at me because I don't know how to do my job properly. This goes on for about 5 minutes and eventually I said, "Who has their eyes on the stand right now?" And he says, "I do," meaning himself. And I said, "Well, that's funny considering your back has been turned to the doors this whole conversation." He told me I could leave for the night, and that is exactly what I did. Eventually the managing staff got so bad, he only lasted about a month there, that I was fired/quit, and I haven't looked back at that place once. It's a shame because it was a great place to work in the beginning, but it took a quick turn downhill. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.